Right now, as you're watching this, American politicians are on television insisting that tariffs are under control, that we're standing up to China, and that this won't really affect ordinary Americans. They're lying, because the moment Beijing announced up to 70% retaliatory tariffs on key categories of U.S. goods, they didn't just hit a few exporters, they detonated a time bomb under roughly 420 billion of U.S. wealth, not in some abstract academic way. In the form of collapsing margins, repriced stocks, impaired farmland, stranded factories, broken supply chains, and a permanent loss of leverage in the one arena America still believes it dominates economic power. The markets won't call it a 40-20 billion wealth destruction event. The headlines won't. But if you trace where actual value lies in a modern financialized empire, and then you follow what a targeted 70% tariff does to that value, the number becomes unavoidable. You've just watched a rival weaponize your own dependence against you. Most people still think tariffs are simple: you tax my goods, I tax yours, we both suffer little, then we negotiate and move on. That's stage 1 thinking. What just happened is stage 4. It's the lady cycle move in a game that's been running for decades. Because China's 70% retaliatory tariffs are not appearing in a vacuum. They're landing at the end of a 4-year process that hollowed out American manufacturing, turned real production into paper valuations, and concentrated U.S. wealth into a few fragile channels, overpriced equities, debt-dependent corporations, and asset-bubbled land. When you structure your entire economy so that shareholder value and leverage stand where factories and savings used to be, then any external shock to your cash flows doesn't just dent earnings, it vaporizes perceived wealth on a massive scale. To understand how a set of tariffs can destroy 420 billion in U.S. wealth, you have to stop thinking like a consumer and start thinking like a balance sheet. That 70% retaliatory tariff on U.S. agricultural products, high-end autos, aerospace parts, tech components, whatever categories Beijing chose to maximize pressure, doesn't just make apples or soybeans or cars more expensive in Shanghai. It makes entire business models non-viable overnight. A Midwestern farm whose economics depended on Chinese demand is no longer worth the price it fetched last year. A manufacturer whose margins assumed access to Chinese buyers at current volumes suddenly has to write down future cash flows. Wall Street, which turned those farms and factories and brands into stock tickers and bond coupons, now has to reprice the income streams behind those symbols. When you add it up across sectors, agribusiness, machinery, energy, autos, semiconductors, luxury goods, services tied to trade, you don't just lose export revenue. You amputate a slice of the valuations attached to those sectors. That's where the 420 billion comes from, the difference between what these assets were worth before retaliatory tariffs and what they're actually worth when China says, your access to our market now costs 70% more. But here's what nobody will tell you on CNBC's. This was mathematically inevitable the moment America decided to build an economic machine that depends on foreign demand while antagonizing its largest foreign customer. There is a pattern to how empires lose economic wars they don't realize they're in. It's not random. It's not about one tariff or one president. It's a 4-stage pattern that is repeated every time a dominant power financializes itself and subsidizes illusions of wealth with debt and offshoring. Stage 1, the empire uses its dominance to turn production into finance. Real factories, mines, and workshops give way to stock options, derivatives, private equity, and buybacks. The home country still looks rich because the numbers on screens go up, but the physical base that produced those numbers starts migrating abroad. Stage 2, the empire becomes dependent on other people's labor and other people's markets. Supply chains stretch across oceans. Key inputs and key customers live inside rival jurisdictions. It feels efficient in the short term. Profits grow. Executives and shareholders celebrate. But underneath, the web of dependency is thickening. Stage 3 politics turn hostile. The empire, now addicted to a certain level of access and deference, begins throwing its weight around sanctions, tariffs, technology bans, financial weapons. Rivals push back. Alliances shift. Trust erodes. Yet the financial markets keep pricing assets as if the golden age of frictionless globalization is still intact. Stage 4. The rival stops playing defense and starts using the empire's dependency against it, not with a nuclear bomb, not with an invasion, with a carefully aimed set of economic weapons, retaliatory tariffs, export controls, alternative payment systems that cause capitalized wealth in the empire's system to evaporate far faster than the rivals. In this stage, every dollar of trade denied hurts the over-financialized empire more than the ascending producer, because one side anchored its power in real production, the other anchored its wealth in leveraged claims on that production. China's 70% retaliatory tariffs land precisely at this stage. And if you think that sounds exaggerated, look at history. In 1930, the United States passed the Smoot Hawley Tariff Act, raising tariffs on more than 20,000 imported goods. It was sold to the American public as a way to protect domestic farmers and manufacturers from foreign competition, exactly the language you heard in the recent wave of trade wars. But the rest of the world did not simply absorb the blow. Countries retaliated. Global trade contracted. Prices fell. Export industries collapsed. Between 1929 and 1933, world trade shrank by roughly 2/3. Smoot Hawley didn't cause the Great Depression by itself, but it threw gasoline on a system already fragile with debt and overcapacity. What did that tariff war destroy? Not little export revenue. It destroyed valuations of farms, factories, banks. It turned paper wealth into dust. Now fast forward to the 1980s. The US and Japan locked into a different kind of trade conflict. Washington accused Tokyo of unfair practices in autos and semiconductors. Instead of 70% tariffs, the US imposed targeted duties and pressured Japan into voluntary export restraints and the Plaza Accord to revalue the yen. Japan, deeply dependent on US markets, accepted the cost, a monstrous asset bubble. Japanese stocks and real estate soared to absurd valuations as capital poured inward. Then, when the bubble burst in the early 1990s, trillions in wealth evaporated. Once again, the visible battleground was trade. The real casualty was financialized wealth. China watched both of those episodes. It studied how tariffs and exchange rate games, not just bullets, could reorder global wealth. It also studied how over-financialized societies could be shattered by a sudden repricing of expectations. Unlike 1930s America or 1980s Japan, however, today's United States is not a rising industrial power learning hard lessons. It's a late-stage hegemon whose elites chose, over decades, to prioritize Wall Street's metrics over Main Street's resilience. That means every external shock is amplified through the leverage built into U.S. assets. Think about how a 70% Chinese tariff on key American exports moves through the system. Start with farmers. For years, American agriculture has been told, feed the world. But the world, in practice, meant a heavy dependence on Chinese demand for soybeans, corn, meat, and more. Farmers borrowed against projected cash flows. Land values rose based on export assumptions. Agribusiness firms went public or levered up based on those margins. When China says, we will now tax your goods at 70% unless you sell them to us at a huge discount or find another buyer, that entire structure takes a hit. Land is worth less. Equity in agricultural firms is worth less. The banks that lent to them hold riskier collateral. The knock-on effects into local economies are immediate. Now look at manufacturers. From high-end machinery to aerospace parts to specialized chemicals, countless U.S. firms built businesses on the idea that China was their growth engine. They justified stock buybacks, dividend hikes, and acquisitions on the back of emerging market demand, especially Chinese demand. A 70% retaliatory tariff doesn't just force them to eat lower margins or lose volume. It reveals that the growth they sold to investors was contingent on a political relationship they did not control. The moment markets internalize that, multiples compress. Again, valuations fall. That's wealth destruction. Add in services. Tourism, education, finance, entertainment. Many U.S. sectors came to treat Chinese consumers and clients as a baseline, not a bonus. Visas, student flows, investment flows. All of these could be dialed back or taxed in ways that look technical but feel like a closed door. If Beijing decides to pair its 70% tariffs on goods with informal or formal barriers to U.S. services, the repricing accelerates. You don't need every company in America to be hit to reach $420 billion in destroyed wealth. You just need enough sectors with high enough valuations to be forced into a lower growth, higher risk world. A few percentage points shaved off the S&P 500's China exposed components. A deeper discount on farmland, wider spreads on debt issued by trade-dependent firms. Multiply those small shifts across a 25 trillion equity market and a 50+ trillion real estate base, and 40-20 billion is not a stretch, it may be conservative. And here's the twist from China's perspective. This isn't even about the tariffs themselves. Just like dumping US treasuries for silver isn't really about the metal, it's about the pattern. The 70% retaliatory tariff is a signal that Beijing is willing to accept some short-term pain on its own export machine to accelerate a strategic realignment, away from selling cheap inputs to an over-indebted hegemon, and toward building a parallel system where its own domestic market and its belt and road partners matter more. It's saying, we don't believe your promises will be honored at face value. We don't believe your markets are permanent. We are willing to burn some bridges to prove it. Once again, the United States misreads this as a simple negotiation tactic. They're just trying to get us back to the table, pundits say. This is leverage for a better deal. That's the same myopia that made British elites dismiss early signs of American ascent, the same arrogance that made Habsburg Spain think it could always borrow more against next year's silver ship, the same complacency that led U.S. officials in the 1960s to assume foreign central banks would never actually demand gold for dollars. In each case, the empire believed others were trapped in its system. In each case, at the margin, the smartest players found the exit. China's 70% tariffs are not an exit from the dollar system, but they are a rehearsal for life outside it. They are a stress test of U.S. political will and U.S. economic vulnerability. They send a signal to the rest of the world. Look how much power we have over the perceived wealth of the American system just by taxing a few flows. In a multipolar financial world, where alternative payment systems and currency swap lines are being built in parallel, that signal matters. It encourages other countries to ask themselves whether tying their fortunes exclusively to the dollar and to U.S. markets is still the safest bet. Meanwhile, ordinary Americans are told none of this. They hear about cheap imports getting more expensive and farmers needing subsidies. They are not told that their retirement portfolios, their home equity, and their local tax base are all downstream from complex global relationships that late stage empires have a habit of mismanaging. They are not told that when a rival slaps a 70% tariff on your goods at the exact moment your debt, deficits, and political chaos are peaking, it is not a random act. It is a data point in a very old pattern. So where does this leave you? If you are sitting in the U.S. or any country closely tied to the U.S. financial system, and your wealth is primarily in overpriced equities whose earnings depend on fragile global demand, debt instruments that assume endless low rates and stable geopolitics, real estate whose value is inflated by cheap money and external capital, then you are effectively long a system that is being tested from the outside and hollowed from the inside. China's 7% tariffs are just one visible edge of that test. There will be others: commodity squeezes, currency blocks, alternative tech standards, sanctions blowback. Each one will take a bite out of the $420 billion and then more. The instinctive reaction is to look for a savior, a new administration, a better negotiator, a fresh deal. But history suggests the real line of defense is not who sits in office. It's where your wealth sits in the pattern. Are you holding the kind of assets that get repriced downward when the illusion of invincibility breaks? Or are you at least partially anchored in things that aren't priced solely on the assumption that yesterday's empire will always be tomorrow's? China is telling you with its actions how it answers that question. It is trading paper for power. It is trading low-margin dependency for higher risk autonomy. It is using tools like 70% tariffs not as an end, but as a lever to accelerate a rotation out of a system it no longer fully trusts. You don't have to cheer for that to learn from it. This isn't about agreeing with Beijing's politics. It's about recognizing that, in a world of weaponized trade and fragile finance, the side that understands the pattern and acts early will always be the one rewriting the rules after the dust settles. The side that confuses rising stock charts with real security will always wake up one morning, look at the new price of its wealth, and ask the same question every complacent empire has asked at the end. How did this happen so fast? It didn't. It just felt that way because you weren't watching the pattern.